Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that some stories and discussions in this episode of Radiant Resilience may touch on sensitive and potentially triggering topics. These may include themes of suicide and suicide loss, mental illness and depression, and grief and trauma. Our goal is to share real-life experiences in a respectful and empathetic manner, offering insights into the complexities of the human spirit and the journey towards resilience. However, we understand that some content might be difficult for listeners. We encourage you to prioritize your well-being and discretion when deciding to listen. Please remember this podcast is not a substitute for professional advice or support. If you find yourself needing assistance, we urge you to seek help from qualified professionals or trusted support systems. Your mental and emotional health is important to us. Thank you for your courage and for joining us in a space of understanding and compassion. Welcome back, everyone, to Radiant Resilience. I have a very special guest today. I have Lisa Sugarman. She is an author, a nationally syndicated columnist, a survivor of suicide loss, a storyteller with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project, and a mental health advocate. She's also the host of the Survivor series on YouTube, a video series designed to stop the stigma of suicide and mental illness. Lisa writes the syndicated opinion column, We Are Who We Are, and is the author of How to Raise Perfectly Imperfect Kids and Be Okay with It, Untying Parent Anxiety and Life. It Is What It Is. Available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere books are sold. She's a regular contributor on the Mental Health Television Network, and her work has appeared on Healthline Parenthood, Grown and Flown, Today Parents, Thrive Global, Little Things, Gatehouse Media, The Washington Post, and Psychology Today. Lisa lives and writes just north of Boston, and you can visit her online now at thehelphub.com.
It's actually thehelphub.co,
my bad.
Yeah, that's okay.
Thehelphub.co. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
Hey, Tawny, I'm great. I appreciate so much just the chance to come on and talk.
Yeah.
I'm doing great.
Good. Yes, I'm very interested in your story. We have not had much suicide talk on this podcast yet, but I think it is a very important issue and unfortunately, something that happens way too often. Why don't you go ahead and start wherever you feel like starting in your story, your personal story, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So it's you and I were chatting a little bit before you hit record, and I told you that I am a survivor of suicide loss, but I'm a 3-time survivor of suicide loss, which is a trifecta that you don't want to have on your resume, but I have it. It's a lot of it has come to light just in the last maybe decade of my life. The first experience I ever had with suicide was also my first experience with death. I lost a cousin of mine who lived a quarter mile up the street. Our families were obviously super close. We were always together. He took his life when he was 18 years old. So that was my first kind of experience losing someone. And my parents were very open at the time, even though it was the early to mid 70s, they still were open enough to let me know what had happened in an appropriate way. And then ironically, my own father passed away the year after. He passed away in 1978. I was 10 years old. But the narrative that I was given was that my dad had a heart attack. There was no warning. There were no signs that he was there and then he was gone. And what makes that part of my story a little bit unique, like I told you earlier, is that my father, I actually lost him twice because 35 years after my father passed away, I discovered the truth that he had died by suicide.
35 years.
Yeah.
And you said your parents were really open about your cousin's suicide, but they were very closed off, or I guess your mom was very closed off about this. Was it because it was hard for her to face as well?
I'm sure, of course. It was gut-wrenching. It was so completely sudden. My father was one of those people who presented in a way that you'd never think that my dad had any kind of mental illness or any kind of issues or depression. He was the person who was in that bucket of it was all inside, it was never visible, you never had a sense that anything was off. And because we're talking about the late 1970s, like nobody was talking about mental health. Men certainly weren't talking about their mental health. And I was an only child. My mom was 40. And my father was gone so suddenly that in that moment when my father did leave a note. So when my mother found that note and really understood what had happened, the idea of now having to tell me that he was gone, and my dad was my person. So all of a sudden, not only is she going to have to tell me that my father's gone, but she's also going to have to tell me that my father had made the decision to leave, had taken his own life. And here I am, this 10-year-old little kid. And in that moment, she just said, I can't do it. I can't layer something that heavy onto something that's already so heavy. So she made up this narrative. My dad was an incredibly fit guy, but he also was fit, active, athletic, but he was also a super heavy smoker, which was such a common thing in the 70s.
Sure.
So I knew that there was heart disease in my dad's family. And my mom just played on that. And in that moment, just said he had died of a heart attack, which was something that nobody, including me, would ever question.
Mhm.
And you connect dots, your 10-year-old brain. We were all starting to learn that smoking was a bad thing. And maybe that's what caused him to have the heart attack. So there was just no question. And there was no need to question anything. So that's what I lived with for 35 years. And then I found out completely by accident that my dad had actually taken his life and had mental illness that was undiagnosed, that nobody was aware of. And it just lit the fuse to this whole complete and total change of direction for me in my life. I was a parenting author. I was writing parenting books. I was super embedded in that parenting space for a really long time. And this just like hard stopped me for a few years from doing anything. Like I withdrew. People wouldn't know that. Anybody who is in kind of my world listening to this would have had no idea that was happening behind the scenes. It was very much like a one person here, and then I was a very different person behind closed doors. And then ultimately, when I first started talking about his suicide and owning that and letting people know what had happened, that was when everything changed for me. When I saw the power of sharing that lived experience and that story and how it empowered other people to get vulnerable and to talk about what they were dealing with, it just shifted everything for me. And so I just jumped headfirst into that space, and that's where I've been ever since.
How did you find out?
So it was just like a random, such an innocuous conversation with a cousin. My husband and I were, my husband and I, we live in a small town north of Boston, and everybody knows everybody. We have family who lives in town, and a cousin of mine, we were eating outside at a restaurant, and my cousin happened to walk by. I hadn't seen her for a long time. She wasn't living in our town anymore. And she came in, she sat down, we're chatting and just catching up, and asked about our girls. So my husband and I have two daughters who are now 24 and 27, but at the time they were teens. And she asked how they were. And then the most random and completely unexpected question, she said, do they have any of the same mental illness that your father had? And I had no idea what she was talking about. And my husband's looking at me like, out of the corner of his eye, what is happening? What is she saying? And it was like when you're in that moment and you're so completely caught off guard by something that you almost don't react. Like I didn't know what to say or do. And I just internalized it and I brushed off the question. And at that time, they weren't experiencing anything out of the ordinary. They were just two regular, average, normal kids. And ultimately, since then, both have had issues with anxiety and with depression and have had some great experiences with medication and counseling and very fortunate for all the resources there are out there. But at that time, they weren't experiencing that. And
Mhm.
so it was such an out of left field question. And it was only after that conversation that I went to my mom, not immediately, but my mom and I are incredibly close. We talk every day. The next time we had lunch, we just started talking about just old stories and reminiscing about my dad, and that came up. And that conversation that I had with my cousin popped into my mind. And before I even knew it, I asked my mother if my dad had any depression, and she said yes. And then the next thing I know, and I to this day, I will never have had a stranger moment in my life. I had no anticipation of asking and no expectation of asking that question. I
Mhm.
just asked my mom if my dad had taken his life, and she said yes. Just
So,
right then and there, she said yes, no hesitation.
wow. So the cousin, I'm assuming that was from his side of the family then that talked to
Yeah,
you. And
yeah.
so did your mom only tell you about the heart attack story?
No, my mother told that was the narrative. That was what everyone knew.
So
Everyone believed.
how did this cousin know about, do you know about how they knew about the mental illness?
That's a very good question. I don't really know the answer to that
Okay.
question. I know that they knew that my father had been depressed. My father came from a really tough family, came from a really, it's so hard to explain. That would be a whole separate conversation that you and I would need to have
Yeah.
over lots of wine. But
Okay.
no, but my dad's family was really difficult. They had a family real estate business. My dad had his own job. He worked for an import-export company in Boston. And at the same time, he also, after my grandfather passed away, took over managing all of the properties in the family business. And it was let's just say this, it was a very demanding and thankless job. My father probably worked 1,000 hours a week for the benefit of his family. Nothing was good enough. Every building was full. Every tenant was happy. The business was thriving. Nothing was ever good enough. My poor father wanted to go out on his own and do that. He found that he had a real aptitude for doing this and he loved it. He wanted to run his own management company and needed the support of his family to do that. They said no. So it
Mm.
was just, I think it was a slow burn. I think it was a buildup of just whatever mental illness he may have had hardwired into him combined with where he lived. Let's put it this way. My grandmother had a nickname for my father. He was the youngest of three children. My dad's nickname was the Unwanted.
Oh.
And the story was ridiculous. My father apparently was born on the night of an eclipse. And back in those days, in the 1930s, like that was a big deal. And my grandmother was annoyed that she couldn't go and see the eclipse because her water broke. And so that was her silly, air quotes for those who are just listening. That was her silly little nickname for my father, but I'm
Mm.
sorry, there's no silliness about a nickname like that. That my grandmother called him for as long as straight through until I was around because I had heard her use that name. And you think about that in someone's background and history and what that does to you as the youngest
Yeah.
child and along with all the other issues that he dealt with his family.
Yeah.
He was in a tough spot. He was in a really tough spot. So yeah, it was just nothing anybody saw coming.
So did
And
your mom tell you, was it just, did dad commit suicide? Yes. And then you moved on from the conversation, or did you guys talk any more about it?
oh no, we've been in this conversation for 11 years now.
Okay.
This has been an ongoing conversation. So my mom and I, as I said, were then and are now as close as you could possibly be. I mean, my mom is my person, my salvation, my everything in the world. And so grateful that she's here and such a part of my day-to-day life and my kids and so on. But no, we had that conversation in that moment. And she had always promised herself two promises that were very contradictory promises. Number one, I will never tell her this because I feel like, what is the purpose of her
Yeah.
knowing he's gone? It won't bring him back. It will cause her more pain. That was her thinking. And I have nothing but gratitude for my mom in that moment. Like I'm a mom. When I found this out, I was a mom already for 20 years. I was
Yeah.
married and I was a mom of teenage children. So I immediately in that moment got it, why she did what she did. And I'm so grateful because I don't know if I could have handled it.
Mm.
But in the same moment that she made the promise to never tell me, she also promised that if for whatever reason, not that there would be one, if there was ever any reason why I questioned it, she would be honest with me. Just didn't think that that reason would ever come to be.
Well, if she told everyone else the heart attack story, then
Mm,
presumably she probably thought that was never going to come out because if she didn't tell anybody about it.
exactly, exactly. But there's another twist. Yeah, it keeps twisting. Maybe 5 or 6 years after I found out about my father, I it took me several years to even talk about it with anybody outside of my parents. My mom and my stepdad and my husband didn't even tell my kids, my daughters, for a couple of years until I felt they were old enough. And then I felt like it was really important just from a perspective of like, okay, this is your inherited DNA. These
Yeah.
things can follow from generation to generation. I want you to know. that this is your grandfather's history and this is what happened. And for a host of reasons, it was important to me to tell them. And I was so grateful that I did. But the irony is, about 5 years after I learned the truth, I had a conversation with another cousin. So my dad was her uncle. She's about, I would say, 12 years older than I am. So I was the baby in terms of all the cousins. And my mother and I believed, my mother never said a word to anyone, not a single soul. So we found out, or I found out, that everyone on my father's side of the family knew it was a suicide, had known since day one that it was a suicide. And no one said a word to my mother. No one, thankfully, said a word to me. The twist part is that my father, on his side of the family, he had an uncle. He was very close with him. He was a physician. He was the one who pronounced my father. And
Oh.
I believe that he was also the person who prescribed my father some pain medication that may have led to his suicide. My
Oh.
my uncle died 2 weeks later, but my uncle was the one who pronounced my father. And I believe he must have told everyone on my
Mm.
father's side of the family. But then when they heard what my mother's narrative was, I think, honestly, I think that they were, if you understood my father's side of the family, you would understand why nothing could compromise the family image. Nothing could
Mm.
taint the way the general population viewed our family. Like everything was about optics back then to such a disgusting degree that they would have done anything to hide that information because of the stigma attached to it. So they knew, but there was no question that they weren't going to say a word to anyone. And the sad thing is they never said a word to my mother, so they couldn't support my mother either.
Oh, yeah.
So we did ultimately find out that more people knew. Again, it was a different time in the
How
world.
did you feel about the betrayal and all of that when, especially first you find out that your mom knew and you
Yeah,
did not, and then you find out that his whole family knew and you guys didn't know and nobody ever, that had to feel really hard.
it felt awful. It sucked. Honestly, it
Yeah.
it sucked. And if I let my mind go there too often or too deeply,
Yeah.
it doesn't stop sucking. I
Yeah.
have a really hard time with that piece of it. The one thing, and I said this a few minutes ago, the one thing that I have absolutely none of is any resentment or anger in any way toward my mom. I am nothing but grateful to my mother. The only thing that I have sadness about, deep sadness about, is that my mom had to just endure this burden for so
Oh.
many decades by herself. Like
Mhm.
they may have known, but it didn't matter because she didn't say anything to anyone. So she kept this. She wasn't in therapy. My mother's very much a pro therapy human, but just never took advantage of therapy for herself in the context of this situation. So it was my mom dealing with this all by herself for 35 years while she was raising a child, while she was taking care of her elderly mother. So my mom had about a million balls in the air, and I feel nothing but gratitude to her. What I am is bullshit that my father's family would allow my mother to go through that without at the very least saying, listen, we know what happened, we know what really happened, and we're here for you. There was almost a complete abandonment of
Mm.
my father's side of the family. And now there were things I just didn't know. I was a 10-year-old kid. So
Sure. Yeah.
there was a lot that kind of went over my head and was off my radar. But as an adult now, looking back and seeing the dynamics and seeing how they let her down, they completely failed my mom.
Mm.
It's funny, all of the anger that I've ever had attached to my dad's suicide has never been focused on my father leaving me.
Okay.
It's always been focused on my mother having to raise me alone, my mother having to keep this secret, my mother having to be in a position to conceal this truth with the secret, like all the things attached to my mom and what she had to go through all those decades later. That's the thing that's the toughest for me. And that's the thing, like maybe it sounds this way, maybe it doesn't, but I feel like it would sound insane for me to say it's such a gift that I know now, but it's such a gift that I know now.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
while I wish more than anything that was not my truth, that was
Sure.
not our story, I'm just so grateful now that I can be there and I can support my mom. And this goes all the way back to your question about was that your only question? Was that your only conversation about it?
Yeah.
Like I said, we have been having, I would say, a constant conversation about this for 11 years.
Yeah.
In
That's really, I'm sure she's so grateful to have your love and support now too.
Mm,
Looking back, do you ever think about what how your life would have gone had you known?
yeah,
Obviously, nothing that's not going to change anything, but it is interesting to me. I mean, losing a parent is traumatic to a child, regardless of the circumstances. But I just wonder if it would have changed your a little bit more of your childhood and upbringing had you known that.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think about it all the time. And I'll tell you, it's interesting because one of the things I talk often about when I have conversations like this, I talk about the belief system that I personally, as a human, had about suicide in terms of selfishness, because it's a
Mm,
super common belief that suicide is a selfish act. Why are you not thinking about the people you're leaving? Why are you not thinking about the pain you're causing? Why are you not thinking about the relationships? I mean, there are a million different reasons why people perceive it as a selfish act. And I was never guided in that direction. I was never influenced to believe that. This was something that I felt as a human being inside, in my own heart, without any coercion from anybody at all. It just happened after I became aware of what suicide was. I was just in my own mind, like 9-year-old mind, like, that's so selfish. What
mm,
about all the people? How come you couldn't have gotten help or found another way or talked to someone? And I carried that for a long time, decades. I carried that. And it was only when I finally understood the truth about my father's death, that belief system completely evaporated. I realized very suddenly, almost, it was almost silly that it happened so quickly and so easily, that once you really understand what mental illness is and what
mm.
it can cause you to do and how it hijacks you, there was no stigma for me anymore. There was no sense of selfishness anymore. That didn't exist. That's how it changed for me. That's that's just how that belief system completely unraveled for me.
Did you have that thought initially when you first found out? Did you ever have the thought that it was a selfish act, like initially when you first very much found out, or was that something you had to work towards?
No, I had it right away. I really and truly had it almost instantaneously. Once I really understood the kind of the depth of where my father's head was at, in as much as we knew, because again, it was not something that my father spoke about. He did start seeing a therapist in probably the last month or so of his life. But my mother only, from what he shared with her, my mother only believed that it had to do with just work stress and wanting to go off on his own business and not getting the support from his family and kind of being at a point like a crossroads of how can I go ahead and do this thing that I really truly want to do for myself and my family if I can't do it, if I don't have the support to do it. So
Yeah.
that was the really hard part for him.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm so sorry that you and your mom had to go through all of that. That's really
Oh,
tough.
thank you. It has been, and aspects of it are still challenging. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter how much time goes by, like that doesn't change. Those sadnesses and those losses don't change. You just integrate them into your life in a different way. They become a little bit more embedded and they don't hurt any less. You live with them, so they accompany you and you understand
Mhm.
that they're there and you coexist. At least
Yeah.
that's how it's been for me.
Yeah. What was the difference? Was there a difference in your grief from initially? You said you lost your dad essentially twice.
Mm.
So was it a different kind of grief when you found out it was the suicide?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It absolutely, because suicide is so nuanced. It's such a different kind of loss. It's such a unique position to be in as a human grieving someone who's gone, because you think about someone passing away of a heart attack, that's beyond someone's control. Someone having cancer or a terminal illness, that's beyond someone's control. Or someone
Yeah.
has a car accident and dies, or any kind of death is and loss is tragic and is horrible to endure for anybody under any circumstances. And I don't like to use the word but that often, but I'm using it now. But a suicide has elements to it that other losses don't have. Like you have that why, which is and can be very haunting. I can tell you that as someone who does not fully know the why with
Yeah.
my father. And we have a lot of suspicions, and there are
Sure.
certain things that we know to be true. My father's note was very brief. It was, I think, one line, and nothing was discussed in terms of there being a catalyst. That why is a little ambiguous for us and always will be. And then there's that sense, I give myself a lot of grace because I was 10 years old. So
Of
I'm not
course.
walking, yeah, I'm not walking around saying, oh my God, like, why didn't I notice? Why didn't I approach him? Why
Mm.
didn't I talk to him? We didn't know.
Yeah,
You can't fix what you don't know is broken.
right.
So that was how I navigated around that part of it. But then there's the, like my mom, what could I have said? What could I have done? And why wasn't I paying attention to certain signs? Why didn't I notice this or why didn't I notice that? So there are all these different layers that come along with suicide, and they don't exist with other kinds of losses. So it just
Yeah.
fundamentally just makes it a shit show in a lot of ways. Like it really does. It's hard. And I will be the first one to tell you that. And I realized I didn't answer your question completely a few minutes ago when you asked, what did I think it would have done to me if
Mhm.
I had known then that it was a suicide? I had a conversation recently with my mom, and I said to her in that context of I don't know how I would have handled it if I had known. I'm not sure I would have made it. I'm honestly not sure if I would have made it at that time, because to know that my father, who I just worshiped the ground that man walked on, he was just such a bright and beautiful light, and he was so kind, and he was so full of life and joy and everything that I am in the world as a human. I feel, or I shouldn't say this because I'm equal parts my mother as well, who is just the most amazing human anyone will ever meet. But my father was like, he was her pair. He was the match to her. And so he was just as much all of those things. And to have known that he made that conscious decision to leave, like my brain would not have known to understand,
Yeah.
okay, daddy was mentally ill, or that we weren't talking like that. There wasn't language, there wasn't a framework to help people that back then, especially kids. I don't know if I would have made it.
Oh,
I don't know what that means, but I think you can probably draw some conclusions, but
yeah.
I just don't know how I would have survived that. It would have been a very different experience. I know what it was like to grow up without your dad.
Yeah.
I just don't know what I would have been like had I
Yeah.
known the truth. And I'm grateful that I didn't know the truth. I just wish the only reason why I wish I had is so that I could have supported my mom in
Yeah.
that time.
Maybe you wish you would have known a little bit sooner than you did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
oh, definitely, definitely, because it had to have been an unbelievable burden to carry that for 35 years by yourself without anyone to talk to,
Yeah.
any outlet to process those things. I don't know how she did it, but she is, even aside from all of that, my mother is like the most remarkable human I've ever known in my life. And you then attach this whole situation and what she did to protect me, and it just makes her next level, in my opinion.
Oh, she sounds like an amazing woman. I
She
want to meet her.
she is, I think, let's put it this way, she has a lot of fans in the world. My
Mhm.
mom has a lot of fans in the world, and she is one of the best people you'd ever meet.
That's amazing. Oh,
Yeah.
you said you were a three-time suicide survivor. So we've got your cousin, your
Mhm.
dad, and what was the third one?
A close, dear friend that we grew up with from the time I was 5 years old, lived
Oh,
together out of college, and our daughter was the flower girl in his wedding, and
mhm.
he was in our wedding, and we've all been together. We have a very tight crew, all of us, believe it or not, since high school, and we're all in our mid-50s now. And this crew has been together for over 40 years, well over 40 years in every aspect of each other's lives. And this was someone who we never for a split second would have ever thought was dealing with what he was dealing with under the surface. And his suicide this was only 3.5 years ago,
Oh gosh.
was an incredible shock to all of us.
So is that still a common thing that people are hiding their mental health struggles and trying to make things look better on the outside? Because I do think the conversation has gotten better over time, obviously, since the 30s when your dad was, born and stuff like that. But that's still very common for people to hide it and then it just be an absolute shock to everyone around them.
Yeah, it is. I can't say that I know that there's an actual statistic that would
Yeah.
say this percentage of people are vocal and this percentage of people are keeping it hidden, but There are people who, for whatever reason, and there are thousands and thousands of reasons, maybe they feel that they won't be supported. Maybe they are terrified of what would happen to them if they call a helpline or they admit that they're suicidal. People, I work on a lifeline. I work with the Trevor Project. I'm on lifelines, suicide and crisis lifelines, multiple times a week, talking to people who are at imminent or high risk of suicide or having an in the moment attempt and trying to de-escalate people. And people, I think, are terrified of, what do I do when I disclose that I'm not okay, or that I'm having ideation, or that I'm making an attempt, or I have a plan? People think that police or EMT is going to bust down their door and drag them to an inpatient unit. And
Mm,
there's a lot. What'll happen to my job? What'll happen to my kids? What'll happen to my relationships? What'll happen to my marriage? There are so many what ifs that people are struggling with. And you got to remember, when someone is in that headspace and they're desperate or hopeless, or they've lost a job or a relationship, whatever it is that they're struggling with, it is exacerbated 1,000 times by the fact that they're depressed, or maybe that they're mentally ill. And so there's not a rational thought process happening in tandem with all of those things. So people think irrationally, like, I can't say anything to anybody because if I do, my life will be ruined in another way. And people are afraid of that. And sometimes that just too many times that overrides someone's sensibility in that moment.
mm.
Oh, okay, I'm either hurting or I'm sick or I'm suffering. I need help. People are just afraid of what will happen to them if they disclose. And it's sad because we lose a lot of people because of that.
Yeah, and I believe that everyone is struggling with something, not to that degree, right?
Yeah.
Necessarily, but
Mhm.
the fact that they feel so alone and like they have to deal with whatever they're dealing with on their own
Mhm.
completely is just heartbreaking to me.
Mhm. It is.
Oh,
It's hard. It's so hard. And there was a statistic. I don't know if it was, I really don't know if it was the Washington Post or the New York Times, but I just last week read a statistic that said, in terms of our thought process as human beings, we all have these thought loops, regardless of who we are or what our life looks like. We have these continuous thought loops that play in our head. And on average, we repeat the same thought loop more than 90% of the time. So
mm,
that means when you are in a negative headspace, those are the things that you're playing over and over again in your head. And when you're alone in your head and you're maybe not reaching out and saying, I'm not okay, I need help, I'm struggling, all of a sudden you've got this loop that just keeps playing. And you're like reinforcing this narrative over and over again. Things are bad, things are hard, things are hopeless, I can't go on. And that's all you're repeating to yourself. And they say that statistic is not just over the course of a day or a week or a month. It's like an endless cycle of the same kinds of thoughts. And that contaminates your brain and it influences your decision making or your lack of the ability to make decisions. It's scary. It's scary. That's why it's so important to share that we're not okay, because you just said it. Couldn't say it any better. We're all struggling with something. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're struggling with mental illness.
right.
Maybe you lost a pet. Maybe you just broke up
Yeah.
with your partner. Maybe you lost your job, or you're about to get evicted, or you're dealing with abuse or homelessness or loneliness, or there aren't enough hours in the day to talk about all the things that we could be affected by, but we're all affected by something.
Yeah, for sure. And I think social media unfortunately makes everything look like it's this perfect picture for
Yeah.
everybody. And that's what people are looking at all the time. And it's just not reality. So, not that everybody wants to throw all their dirty laundry on social media either. It's also just provides this fake, not real picture of the
Mhm.
world. And it's just not true. So, then I think
Yeah.
that isolates people even more with having that at our fingertips these days.
It does, because it's this perfectly curated image of 94 seconds of somebody's day, whatever it may be. And those may have been 94 great seconds, but what about what else is happening off the camera
Yeah.
with that person, or all of these other, let's say, influencers, or let's say just communities of people online? And it sends such a false message to everybody else who's out there that if you're not doing these things and if your life doesn't look like that, you have a shitty life. And that's so unrealistic.
Yeah.
And it's really sad because I do applaud a lot of people who are out there and who are not giving in to that whole concept of perfection, and they're out there being real, and that's what we need more of. And we need people to be sharing our stories
Yeah.
because our lived experience does a lot of things to infuse people with hope and with the idea that it is okay to share when we're not okay. And
Yeah.
the more that we do that, the more of a safe space the world becomes, instead of this place where you just feel like you have to measure up. Instead, it allows people like, okay, it's not just me. Like it gives people the reassurance, like, oh my God, thank God it's not just me dealing
Yeah.
with whatever I'm dealing with. There are other people out there too.
Or I know with my own life struggles, I'll get in a certain headspace and I'll think some not very nice things about whatever it may be. And
Mm,
to find out that I'm not, because sometimes I'll feel like I'm crazy for feeling that way. And I'm a horrible person for thinking these things or feeling this way
mhm.
towards whatever it is. And then to find out that I'm not alone and other
Yeah.
people are thinking those same things and it's okay to feel those feelings and think those things. It's so comforting.
And it is comforting, and it's comforting, it's cathartic, and it's important because
Yeah.
then we recognize that the playing field is a lot more level than anybody really believes it to be. Like we have this perception that there are some people who just have great lives and
Mm.
who have everything that they need and have everything that everybody else wants. And look, in some cases, there are definitely people out there in the world who have different things that we all wish we had, but we don't recognize that there are also people out there in the world wishing they had what we had. We just don't
Yeah.
think of it. We don't stop to think of it because our natural inclination as humans is to think about what we don't have, or think about what we aren't,
Mhm.
or think about how we can't get to where we want to be, when we don't realize that in a lot of cases we're actually already there. We're in the place we want to be. We just don't see it for what it is.
Yeah, it's so true.
Hmm.
I've struggled with my own infertility, and I have often throughout my journey been envious of others who were able to have children, who have
Yeah.
children, whatever it may be. But I have found in my healing journey, I have a wonderful relationship with my husband, and I absolutely adore him, and he adores me. And I'm so grateful for that because a lot of the people I know who do have children, and not saying that's the catalyst necessarily, but everybody
Yeah.
that has children doesn't necessarily have a happy marriage. For me, it's been like realizing that of, okay, we don't have this, but we have this, and I need to focus more on this and the positive and the gratefulness. And it's, I don't know why as humans, it is so easy to focus on the negative in
Mm.
everything. I even struggle with it sometimes at work. I have some amazing clients that come and see me, but then I'll have one bad experience with somebody and it ruins my whole week.
Yeah. Yeah. I think unfortunately, we're predisposed to track negative
Mm.
in
Why, I
general.
wonder?
I don't know. I think a lot of it must have to do with just projection, and
Mm.
it's easier to, I don't know, commiserate with the
Yeah.
bad stuff that happens around us than celebrating the good. I don't know why in the world that would be, because you would think that everybody would just naturally want to celebrate
Yeah.
the good that's out there in the world and the good that's happening in your life. I think unfortunately it's human nature, and it's the way a lot of people are wired, that our head just innately goes to that negative place. Like, why do we rubberneck when there's an accident on the highway? We all want to be able to get to where we're going. We don't want to stop, but yet we're so compelled we have to stop. And it's the same mentality, I think.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because we actually all have to practice being positive and grateful. And how much are you hearing about that nowadays too,
Mhm.
especially with mental health and all
Mhm.
that stuff? It's have a gratitude practice, focus on the good in your life, change what you're telling your self-talk to more positive. Like we're
Mhm.
having to work for the good, but we don't have to work even slightly for the bad. It's, I don't know, I feel like I need to do a psychology deep dive.
I think I want
So
to do that. I
fascinating.
want to do that deep dive with you because it is fascinating, and it's a sad statement. It's amazing too. You talk about reframing and spinning things, and I do that a lot very intentionally when I find my headspace going to a place I don't want it to go. Even if it's, let's just use it as an example, just if I don't want to get up and go to the gym. It's dark out, it's cold out, it's winter, it may be snowing, I don't want to go. And we look for every reason not to do that. But as soon as I spin my headspace to think about it in different terms, wait a minute, I get to go, not I have to
Mhm.
go. I get to go and do this. I get to do this for my mind and my body and my spirit. And I'm in this place of being able to give myself what I really need. Sometimes that's all that it takes to just shift your thinking is by flipping things around, flipping that script around. We just don't do it enough.
Yeah, and it does take practice. It's not an easy thing to do. So it takes time to switch your mind around, even about something like that, too.
Yeah.
That's a simple
Mhm.
thing. There are so many bigger, harder, more complicated situations that it's even harder to change your mindset around. But I wonder why. I'm so curious now. I don't know why we do that. I don't know why we're so focused on the negative and the
I
bad
know.
things.
Yeah, maybe because when we see the bad things with other people, it means it's not happening to us and there's some kind of a comfort there.
Yeah,
Maybe.
that's true.
Yeah. What I do know is that after you and I are done recording, we're both going to do a deep dive search on why this is, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, there's got to be somebody that's studying this out
I'm
there for
sure.
sure. Oh
I'm
my
sure.
goodness. So, all these experiences for you led you into doing some suicide and mental health advocacy work then?
Yes, very much.
And
Yeah.
how has that been? You said you're on the, what did you call, what is the, I'm sorry,
The
the,
Trevor Project.
yeah, how is that experience? That's got to be tough to experience, and you're doing good because you're helping these people,
Mm.
but also what a tough position to be in for somebody to call you at their deepest despairs and you have to try to talk them out of it, and somebody you don't even know.
Yeah, it's a very unique position to be in, especially as a survivor of suicide loss. That is, to me, it is not lost on me what a unique position it puts me in. And it's interesting because I've had so many conversations with my husband, with my mom, with my children. I am what you would call a highly sensitive person to an extreme degree. Like I'm an empath. I've always been an empath. And for me, I feel everything very deeply. I feel the good, the bad around me very acutely. And especially where this subject is concerned, it's obviously a very personal connection that I have to all of this. And so everybody in my family was very vocal, not in a non-supportive way, but in a very realistic way. They're like, are you sure that you can be in this situation and
Yeah.
be okay? And I said, look, I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that question. What I can tell you is that I believe right now that this is where I need to be. I believe that this is one of the things that I need to be doing to honor my dad and his life and to make some sense out of what's happened to me and to help make sure that it doesn't become an option for other people. Like something has to change. And the only way we make that change is when we activate and we get involved in that fight to change whatever it is we're trying to change. And so I knew that I belonged in that place. And I promised myself and I promised my family, I said, look, if I ever get to a point where I go through all this training, because it's a very rigorous training that you go through with the Trevor
I
Project.
imagine, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, much the same kind of training you go through to be a 988 crisis operator. I'm also certified as a 988 lifeline operator, but I work with Trevor Project. And I said, look, all I can promise everybody is that if I get to a point, at any point, where I feel like emotionally it's hitting me too deeply, it's too close to home, it's too difficult to separate, then I will find another way to get involved. I will find another way to make an impact. And maybe that isn't the way for me. So now I've been on the lifelines over 2 years. And I can tell you without any hesitation whatsoever, it was the best decision I have ever made
Mm.
out of anything that I have ever done. And I do a lot of different things in a lot of different spaces. I know you mentioned that I work with the National Alliance on Mental Illness as a storyteller, telling the story of my father, what we've been talking about for the last hour. I talk about that all around the Boston area to schools, civic organizations. I do a lot with first responders. I've become through the Samaritans. They have a program. It's a virtual, in some places it's virtual, in others it's in person. It's a support group for survivors of suicide loss. So it's a very specific type of support group. And I'm a trained facilitator for the Safe Place Survivor of Suicide Loss group. So I'm in a lot of different pockets, doing a lot of different work, and being on the lifelines with the Trevor Project has absolutely been one of the greatest gifts that not only I've ever gifted to myself, but that has found me, because I'm at that place where that epicenter of that place where people who are hopeless, people who are about to choose this one option that my father chose, and I'm the one at the crossroads. I'm the one who has the capacity to change the outcome. I have been, gifted now the tools and the strategies and the language and the understanding of how to de-escalate someone, how to give someone the resources they need, how to hold space in a way that I've never held space before,
Wow.
because you relearn all of that. And I just feel like there is probably no greater gift that I have in my life right now than being able to be on the phones in that position. Yeah, there are tough days. I had a day, it was probably a month or two ago. I had a day where I had 3 back-to-back imminent risk suicide calls. And
Oh,
you are on those calls. If I start my shift at 9 a.m. and I'm on an imminent risk suicide call, for instance, that I need to develop a safety plan, I need to de-escalate someone, all the things that need to happen. If that call's 5 hours long, I'm on that call for 5 hours. Whatever it turns out to be, I'm in it
wow.
until it's over. And so they weren't 5 hour long calls in this case, but they were 3 back-to-back imminent risk suicide calls. And I definitely got off that shift. And even my supervisors were like, are you okay? That was incredibly heavy. Are you okay? And it just means that I have to be very diligent with my own self-care practice
Yeah.
and separating and getting outside in nature, go for a run, go lift weights. My husband's amazing. We both work from home. If I have a tough moment, he's there for it. My daughters are too. But it's definitely where I believe that I need to be in the world, and I'm just grateful to be there.
How many days a week do you do that?
It depends. They're our commitment. If you are interested, if someone's listening right now and they're interested in becoming a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project, the commitment is that you obviously go through the training, which is probably a several month long asynchronous on your own time training program. And then the commitment is 1 year, at least 1 year. And it's 1 3 hour shift a week.
Okay.
It depends on, I mean, I have a lot of other things going on right now, and I do a lot of other volunteer work and group facilitation and things like that. So I lately have really only been able to do 1 or 2 shifts a week, but there have been times where I've done 2 or 3 or 4 shifts a week, depending on the need. And for instance, after the election, as you can imagine, we had a 700% call surge.
Wow.
Yeah, and so we were getting emails and notifications like every 20 minutes saying, if you're free, if you're free, if you're free, can you hop on the network? We're inundated. So our call volume increased 700% in one day. A lot.
That's
That just blows your
eye-opening.
mind. Mhm. Yep,
Oh my
yep,
gosh.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. It ranges. I try to be on as often as I can. That's definitely a priority for me. And for as long as the Trevor Project exists, I want to be on those lifelines. So it's not, for me, it's not like a one and done. Here's my year as a counselor. I love the organization. I love the work that they do. I feel incredibly grateful to be able to do it, and we'll do it as far as the eye can see.
I'm glad that's been a positive light in your life for you.
It has. It really truly has. Yeah.
I'm sure it's rewarding to
Mhm.
be able to help people like that. I think that's incredible, especially after what you've been through.
Yeah, it is. I feel so grateful when you talk to someone who maybe it's someone who's trans, who's never used the name that they would like to be using in the world, and they use it with you for the first time, and you become a safe place. And that's the first time they've ever heard that name out loud and said it to another person. Like the feeling that you get, or when someone comes out to you and says, I think I'm gay. I believe I'm gay. I've never said that to a living soul. Or when someone says, I don't want to live anymore.
Mm.
And by the end of the phone call, they do. And they say, I didn't want to live when I picked up the phone, but thank God you were the person who called, who I called and who got the call. Like that, you can't even measure what that is,
No.
what that does to your heart. And look, not all calls are created equal. Some are long and hard and
Sure.
emotional and all the things. But I mean, at the end of the day, when you can have someone who's in that state of mind when they pick up the phone and call you, grateful and thanking you through tears that you were the one that picked up the phone at the end, like, I don't know. I don't know what better feeling there is than that.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
I have a weird question for you.
Okay. I'm here.
Um,
I'm all for it.
I know there's been in the past, at least when I was younger and stuff, some people I'm gonna assume that this is mostly a younger person thing, who would throw around suicide as maybe more of an attention, or it was perceived that way as an
Mhm.
attention grabbing. They weren't necessarily serious on acting on it.
Mhm.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, if that's something that maybe we were all looking at in the wrong light, or I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I can tell you what my thoughts are as a crisis counselor. My thoughts as a crisis counselor are we never invalidate anyone ever for any situation, how they're feeling, why they're feeling that way under any circumstances. Like, it doesn't matter if this person has called us, and we have a lot of what we call familiar voices. People who call regularly every day, multiple times a day for whatever reason. We might have the same person call 27 days in a row and threaten to take their life, and we are going to take that threat seriously every single solitary time. Yeah. Look, as a human being who has a rational brain, do I believe that at times people in the world do certain things, say certain things because they're seeking attention? Yes, I do. I think we probably all, to some degree, have done certain things in our lives. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that it's just threatening to take your life. I just mean people have definitely said and done things that were more extreme than they needed to be because they wanted to get attention or they felt they just needed to make a statement. Look, we'd all be foolish to say that doesn't exist. I
Yeah.
think that I'm sure that it does at times, and that unfortunately there are probably people who leverage that kind of behavior to get a response. But in terms of what I do when I'm on a lifeline
Yeah.
and how my brain is now trained to work, anyone, whatever it is that they're saying, whatever it is that they're struggling with, that's however outlandish it might seem or be, we are validating every bit of it
Yeah.
and holding space for that. I just think that in terms of the percentage of people, and I don't know what that percentage could be, people who are maybe crying out for help in that way and they're leveraging that and maybe they aren't that serious, but they're going to say it anyway. It's unfortunate that someone would have to go to that degree.
Yeah.
If that were the case, it's unfortunate because it's a scary place to go and it's a scary place to put someone else. There are two people involved. It's the person saying it and the person receiving it. And it's
Yeah.
scary. It's scary as hell. I don't care if you're trained or you're not trained. When somebody says, I don't want to be here anymore, I want to take my life, that is a hard place to be. So it's unfortunate. I think there are definitely people out there in the world who probably do say that when it isn't really their intention. And it's unfortunate because then it takes time and space away from people who are really in that headspace.
Yeah.
But look, I try to take everything at face value and I try to understand what there's always a behavior behind whatever it is that someone's saying and doing. And I just try to honor that and respect that and acknowledge them for what they're saying in that moment. I think we all
Yeah.
have to.
Yeah. I just was thinking back to like when I was a teenager and stuff, and I feel like there were a lot of, at least stories I heard, were teenage girls who were just throwing that stuff around to get the attention and stuff like that. And
Mhm.
like I said, maybe that was just the narrative I was told too at that age. Because I also don't think that people would throw, even a young person would throw that around for absolutely no reason at all. There is
Right.
something behind them feeling the need to throw that out there,
Mhm.
serious or not. But I do think that's changed a bit too, because I think we've all buckled down a little bit more on the severity of that threat, right? You can't just throw that one around because
Right.
that is a very serious threat. And so I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think those are my thoughts that I'm sure that kind of behavior does exist, unfortunately. But again, I think that it's a cry for something.
Yeah.
And but it may display as a dramatic cry for something, but it's still a cry for something. So I think that when we take people seriously and take them at face value, we figure out a lot quicker where it's coming from.
Yeah. Are there resources out there for parents of children who are struggling with this?
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the organizations that I'm affiliated with that I promote a lot of what they do, and they've been incredibly supportive of what I do, is the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide.
Okay.
They are a fantastic organization that is working to educate both teens and young children and parents on suicide and mental illness and everything from anxiety and depression, and there's incredible resources that they have available within that organization. I would definitely recommend that any parent have that on their radar.
Yeah.
To know that they're out there as well. And there are a lot of other organizations, for instance, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, that's the storytelling organization. One of the things they do is tell stories to help people with mental illness, but they're also this incredible grassroots organization that is dedicated to providing information and resources and services to help people understand mental illness and suicide awareness and prevention. There's another organization, I'm an ambassador for an organization called Same Here Global Healthcare Movement. Their name is actually hashtag, that's actually part of their name. It's hashtag Same Here.
Okay.
And they're if you're looking at me right now, you can see that I'm doing kind of the sign for like me too, same here. That's their symbol, and they are an amazing organization that will go into schools, and in particular schools, but other organizations, and educate the educators and the student body and the parent population about mental illness, mental wellness. It's an unbelievable organization with incredible resources that parents should also be aware of as well.
Yeah, because I think that's becoming more and more common. Our teens are really struggling these days. Parents who maybe don't know what to do or where to go, but I think you're right. I think being aware of all of these things in advance, maybe before your kid gets to that point, that would be obviously a lot more helpful than being thrown into it. But
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's like how I tell everybody I meet to put the 988 crisis lifeline number in your phone.
mm,
Just embed it in your brain, know that it exists, feel like you can share it with people if you need to, because at the end of the day, eventually, somehow, somewhere in your life, you're going to come across someone who is not okay
mm,
to such a degree that you're going to need to help them, or you're going to be asked to help them, and you want to know how to help them. And
mm,
you're not supposed to be there to be the one to save them necessarily. It's not necessarily our responsibility as individual humans to come in and fix the problem, but we can help support and help hold space and redirect the person who might be struggling to the resources that they need. So in addition to resources like the ones I mentioned, like Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide and Same Here Global, get the 988 number in your phone, keep it accessible so that if a crisis happens, you immediately know that you have a place to turn.
what a crazy trajectory your life went after finding out about your dad. Because I'm assuming you didn't do any of this prior to that, or you were.
No,
So
yeah, no,
to
I
bring
was,
all this onto your radar and then completely change the trajectory of your life. But it all sounds like it's very rewarding and fulfilling and something you're enjoying.
yeah, it's all of those things. And it's strange. I'm glad you just said the word enjoying, because it's when I think about it, and I use words like grateful and enjoyment and things like that, positive words like that about a subject like this, about mental illness and suicide in particular, which is the sweet spot of where I am in the world. It seems almost strange to use those words, but it's true. I am grateful, and I do get enjoyment and gratitude and fulfillment from being able to help people who may not otherwise know where to turn or what to do. And I feel like there's a purpose behind everything if we look closely enough. And I just feel very grateful to have been paying attention to the signs. I remember, because I've always been a content creator, and I remember when my mother and I first started, I found out the truth about my father. And then, of course, the conversation that continues to this day, a decade later, started. I remember my mother even saying to me very early on, before I was even willing to accept the thoughts myself, she was like, you can write about this someday. I feel like you're going to write about this or do something with this someday. And I want you to know that I have nothing but hope in my heart that you will someday be able to do that. And that was way before I was even ready to entertain that idea. And slowly it became more of a reality. And now, of course, my entire life looks so radically different than it did even 3 years ago
Oh,
when I
wow.
started talking about it. It's the only thing that I want to be doing in the world. And it's something that it just, it gives me inspiration like you can't imagine when someone uses one of the resources that I've created, or someone reads a piece that I've written, or someone watches. I have a video series, the Suicide Survivor series on YouTube. When I have some random person DM me and say, hey, I just saw your video and I was in a really dark moment and your video gave me hope. Those are the things that give me that joy and that satisfaction. And that's what keeps me going. And I know it'll be what sustains me to keep doing
Right.
it.
You're saving lives
I
and
hope so. I really hope
you're
so.
changing people's perspectives to a more positive perspective. And I think we all need to find a little bit more enjoyment on helping others and lifting
Mhm.
others up and being there for people. Because sometimes I think our society is just enjoying tearing each other down sometimes. So,
I could not agree more. And
oh,
that, and I wish that weren't the case. I
sure.
really wish that
Yeah.
weren't the case. And I know you do too, but it's the reality of the world that we're living in. And again, it's being able to be of service that has brought me the most incredible joy. And being able to be of service in this particular space, it's such a hard space to be in, but it's such a space that we need all the reinforcements we can get, like in this
Yeah.
mental health space, especially now, especially this week,
Yeah.
as the world has in lots of ways been turned upside down and
Yeah.
been even more divided. So it's been a beautiful thing to see how mainstream mental health and wellness has become,
Yeah.
but it's never been as important as it is right
Yeah.
now. And that's why I'm just grateful that I can put resources out there into the world that are making a difference, and not just for me and for my community, but for all the communities I've been working on. It was like just a passion project that has completely overtaken everything
Mm.
that I've been doing lately.
Passion projects end up doing.
I know it's crazy. So I had rebranded my website to be kind of a destination for suicide awareness and prevention materials and content and resources and tools and strategies and all of those things. And in doing that, I was quietly building up a resource page, just like what any organization would have when they're integrated into their website, where you have other organizations that you can call if you need a variety of help. But we always tend to have resource pages that have a dozen or a couple dozen of what you would consider to be not top tier, but most widely known
Yeah.
organizations, generic organizations. And the more work I did on Christ's Lifelines, and the more speaking I did and the more listening I did, I realized that we all deal with grief, we all deal with loss, we all deal with mental illness, anxiety, depression, all of those things, but we deal with them in very different ways when we're parts of different communities.
Mm.
And so many factors exist that change the way that we experience all of those things, depending on who we are in the world, what our background is, our socioeconomic background. Like there are a million different things that have an impact on how we grieve or keep ourselves well and all those things. So I started disseminating all of these resources that I was finding and putting them into groups, because I had this massively long list of organizations that had no structure, and it was just a big long list. And I started breaking them apart into the BIPOC community, or children and teens, or veterans, or the AAPI community, or the LGBTQ community. And I ended up with 16 different categories where you can find help and tools and resources and content and information. And now I just this week relaunched my website. It's no longer lisasugarman.com. It is now thehelphub.co, and it's where you go to access this massive directory with hundreds and hundreds of organizations. And that's now the central foundation of my website. And there's a ton more on there as well. And it's something that I'm incredibly proud of, that I've already seen has helped so
Mm.
many people find the resources that they need quickly and easily. And I feel little by little, it's getting out there into the world. And with some help and some hope, we'll find the people who need it.
Yes, and we will link it in the show notes for sure. So if anybody needs any of those resources or if any of that resonated with you, the helphub.co.
That's it. That's
Okay.
right. Yep, yep, yep.
I'm
I
like, oh,
jumped.
I'm gonna mess it up again.
No, 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 it's okay. I jumped on the CO bandwagon, and
Okay. What is
yeah,
that? I don't even know the
it's just
difference.
instead of this .org, .com,
Yeah.
.co, .io. So it just so happened that the Help Hub was available. The domain name was available with a .co, and those are
Okay.
becoming very mainstream now. So I scooped it up.
Nice. Okay.
Hmm. Yeah.
Anybody, if you just listen to that little bit, go check out the helphub.co if
Yep.
you need any of those resources. I think that's amazing. And I'm so in awe of all of the stuff that you are doing and your
Thank you.
story. And we need more Lisa Sugarmans in the world, I think, for sure. So
That's
thank
very
you
sweet. Thank you.
for sharing your story and for all of the things that you're doing because I think it's incredible work.
Oh, I appreciate that so, so much more than when I appreciate just you having this conversation. I know that you have not had that many of this type of conversation,
Yeah.
and I just can't tell you how much I appreciate being able to have it here and being able to talk to your community and your audience and put these resources and these conversations out into the world in just another place. So thank you to
You're welcome. Thank you. Do
you.
you have any last parting words for anybody listening? I don't know, maybe somebody who's struggling with their mental health currently or anything really. What do you got?
What I got is this. If you're struggling, and we all do in so many different ways, and we're all so isolated in our own heads, like you and I were talking about, we tend to think we're the only one dealing with it, and that it will always be the kind of struggle it is in that moment when you're in the thick of it. If you're in the thick of it and you're listening to this, you will not always feel this way. You
Mm,
will not always feel hopeless or alone or lost or whatever it is you're dealing with. There is another side to it, and you will find that other side. You will make it to that other side. So don't be afraid to sit in it, even if it's not great where you are right now. Sitting in it is part of how we move through it.
mm,
And the other most important part is reaching out for help, either making that call to that 988 number if you don't have a resource or a community, or if you do have resources in a community, lean into those. Let people know what's going on. Don't be afraid to say, I'm not okay, because you will be shocked at how many people will say, you know what? I'm not either. So let's figure it out together.
yeah, I love that. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
you're so welcome.
I appreciate you so much and I appreciate you for having this conversation with me. So thank you so much. And yeah, everyone, if you're looking for any help, we will link all of Lisa's stuff in the show notes. And I hope you're all having a better week. But thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.